Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to another Hidden Scriptures Word Study. Today we're going to talk about the feast and the common misconception that I can't speak for anyone else, but I was raised in this misconception that the feasts were only for the Jews. Okay, so we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about that today, I should say. So let's get right into it. And the title I have for today is, let me get my mouse over to my other screen here. Number today, word study is, I think it's 202. Yes, 202 is the number for the word study today. And the title I have for today is Scripture Reveals that the feast, the biblical feast, were for everyone, not just for the Jews. There is a common misconception by those involved with lawless religion that the feasts of the Bible were only for the Jews. Where did this common misconception come from? Well, it came from 3 verses that are found only in the book of John, which I'm going to show you right now. There's 3 verses. I am only going to show you 2. John chapter 5 and verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. Okay, and then the second one is John 7, chapter 7 and verse 2. Now the Jews' feast of tabernacles was at hand. Okay, today in the word study, we are going to look at what the law of Moses, the Torah, had to say about these feasts and find out if these biblical feasts were truly only for the Jews. Father willing, before the fall feast of tabernacles, Sukkot, comes around again, I will do a word study. Father willing, I will do a word study on how to keep these feasts in our modern lives today, and whether or not we can even keep them. So we'll get into that, Father willing, somewhere between now and the fall. I'll do a word study on that topic right there. Now, the first feast of the year is Passover unleavened bread. That always happens in the spring. Okay, Exodus chapter 12, verses 14 through 20. And remember, the focus of this word study is, are these feasts really only for the Jews? Okay, so we're going to start off in Exodus chapter 12, verses 14, and we're going to read down to verse 20. So this day, referring to Passover unleavened bread, shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to Yahovah throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. Verse 15, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation. It's talking about a high Sabbath. And on the seventh day, there shall be a holy convocation, a high Sabbath. And our regular weekly Sabbath will fall between these two high Sabbaths. No manner of work shall be done on them on the high Sabbaths, but that which everyone must eat, that only may be prepared by you. So somebody asked me the other day about food preparation on the high Sabbath, if it was allowed, and I said, yeah. And this verse 16 shows the evidence right there that on the high Sabbath we can prepare food. Okay, verse 17. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the first month, now please note that the word month right here, this is the New King James Version. The word month is in italics. So that means that that word was not in the original Hebrew manuscripts, okay? It was added. But we go down here to month right here, and that Hebrew word for that word month is H2320, and it's Kodesh. And the definition of Kodesh is new moon. So in the first new moon, in the first month, on the 14th day of the new moon, on the 14th day of the month, at evening. When is evening? Evening is between sunset and total darkness. You shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the new moon of the month at evening. So 7 days. This verse 18 is telling us that the children of Israel were to eat unleavened bread for 7 days. Okay. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel. Watch this. Whether he is a stranger, talking about a grafted in Gentile, Romans chapter 11, verses 13 through 25, and Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 12. And I am going to repeat these passages almost every time that I mention a grafted in Gentile, because this is talking about us. Okay. A stranger, a grafted in Gentile, is talking about us. If we have chosen to be assimilated among the house of Israel, and if we have chosen to be assimilated among the house of Israel, then the Father wants us to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay? Because he says that any person who eats leavened bread I'm talking about a loaf of bread. I'm talking about a box of donuts. I'm talking about anything, or it's talking about anything. Leavened. So the Father wants us, grafted in Gentiles, if we have chosen to be assimilated among the house of Israel. The Father wants us to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days. We are to get rid of all the leavening agents from our house, the yeast, uh, anything with leaven in it, anything with yeast in it, anything that has been baked with leaven or with yeast, we are to remove it from our houses for 7 days and eat only unleavened bread. The Father wants, has invited, and welcomes the grafted in Gentile to partake of this 7-day feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat nothing leavened. No bagels, no sandwich from a loaf of bread, no donuts, anything, no cake, no brownies, nothing that was baked with leaven for 7 days. We are not to eat any of that. We are to get it all up, get it all out of our house. Okay, and it's, you really have to pay attention. I mean, because we all throughout the year we've had this habit of eating bread. For those of us who have a donut once in a while, it's a year-long habit. So to stop this habit for 7 days, you got to really pay attention to what you're doing. Okay, so that is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That is a feast that the Father wants grafted in Gentiles to also partake in. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread is not only for the Jews. Okay, let's continue. This is another scripture on the same topic, on the same feast. Exodus chapter 12. We start off in Exodus 12, verses 14 through 20. Now we're going to drop down to Exodus, same chapter of 12, verses 47 through 49. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it, referring to Passover unleavened bread, when a stranger, a grafted in Gentile, Romans chapter 11, verses 13 through 25, and Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12. When a stranger dwells with you, has chosen to be assimilated among you, and wants to keep the Passover to Yahovah, he's invited to, he's welcome to. Let all his males be circumcised. That's the only caveat right there, is that an uncircumcised male is forbidden to celebrate the Passover and keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And let him come near and keep it. And he shall be the circumcised, grafted in Gentile, and he shall be as the native of the land. For no uncircumcised person shall eat it, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, so in the Father's eyes, if a grafted in Gentile who is physically circumcised wants to keep the Passover and unleavened bread, he's welcome to. He's encouraged to. He is invited to. In fact, more than that, it says right up here that if a person eats anything leavened during that 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel. So not only does the Father welcome the grafted in Gentiles, but it is, in my mind, essential that the grafted in Gentile keep the 7-day feast of unleavened bread. Okay, verse 49, one law, one Torah. Okay, it is another common misconception amongst lawless religion that there are two laws. One law for the Jews, one law for the Gentiles. Well, that obviously is not true, because the scripture tells us right here that there is only one law. One Torah shall be for the native-born Israelite and for the stranger, the grafted in Gentile. Romans chapter 11, verses 13 through 25, and Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 12. Who dwells, who has chosen to be assimilated among you. So, folks, don't let anyone tell you that there are two laws, because it simply is not true. The Father, who is the lawgiver, says that there is only one law, and what the Father says, the Father has established, and it is established forever. Okay, so that is the first feast of the year, Passover unleavened bread. And the scripture clearly tells us that the first feast of the year, Passover unleavened bread, is not only for the Jew. Okay, let's move on to the second feast of the year, which is Shavuot, Pentecost. This is a one-day feast. And you shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. Okay, that is an agricultural term, okay? But the focus that we need to remember concerning this passage is the mentioning, actually 2 times, of the 7 weeks. You shall count 7 weeks. Begin to count 7 weeks. Okay. Then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks. That's why the Feast of Weeks is called the Feast of Weeks. Okay. It's also called the Feast of Shavuot, and it is called the Day of Pentecost. Okay, because this Feast of Weeks, this Feast of Shavuot, this Feast of Pentecost is a one-day feast. And it always happens on the first day of the week. That is the only time of the year, unless a high Sabbath just by chance falls on that day. But if that doesn't happen throughout the year, the only time of the year that the first day of the week is considered a Sabbath is on the one-day Feast of Weeks, the one-day Feast of Shavuot, the one-day Feast of Pentecost, because we are to count 7 weeks from the Sabbath, from the weekly Sabbath, inside the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, remember I mentioned that the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we're going to have a high Sabbath at the beginning of the feast and a high Sabbath at the end of the feast. In the middle of that, we will have a weekly Sabbath. The 7 weeks we are to count from that weekly Sabbath, which is the 7th day of the week. We count 7 weeks. we add one day, it will always be the first day of the week. And that is the only time of the year that the first day of the week is a Sabbath. Unless, of course, a high Sabbath just by chance falls on that day. Okay, let me see, where was I? Okay, we're back here in Deuteronomy chapter 16. So that's why it's called the Feast of Weeks. Then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks, the one-day Feast of Shavuot, the one-day Feast of Pentecost, always on the first day of the week after the 7 weeks, to Yahovah your Elohim with a tribute of a free will offering. Why did I highlight free will offering? This is a rabbit trail. You guys who watch my videos, you know that I go down these rabbit trails. The reason I highlighted free will offering is because the 10% tithe, it doesn't matter who tells you anything different. The 10% tithe does not exist. It has not existed since the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the annihilation of the Levitical priest under Herod. Okay? I think it was Herod who was responsible. It might have been, who knows? It might have been Nero. It might have been Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know who annihilated the Levitical priest, but they were annihilated. Okay? The temple was destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed. Since that time, and this happened anywhere from 67 to 70 AD, from that time, the 10% tithe ceased to exist. Okay, what we give now is a free will offering. It's not a tithe. The tithe does not exist. It is a free will offering, and the free will offering is not limited to 10%. Okay, if you want to give 12%, if you want to give 20%, it's up to you. But we are required, we are obligated to give a free will offering. Then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks, the one-day Feast of Shavuot, the one-day Feast of Pentecost, to Yahovah your Elohim, with a tribute of a free will offering from your hand, which you shall give as Yahovah your Elohim blesses you. You shall rejoice before Yahovah your Elohim, you and your son and your daughter and your male servant and your female servant, the Levite who is within your gates, the stranger, the grafted in Gentile, Romans chapter 11, verses 13 through 25, Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 12, and the fatherless and the widow who are among you, in the place where Yahovah your Elohim chooses to make his name abide. Okay, where is that? It is in Jerusalem. Okay, so that was the second feast of the year, the one-day Feast of Shavuot, Pentecost weeks. And we have the grafted in Gentile, welcomed and invited to keep this feast. So the one-day Feast of Shavuot, Pentecost is not only for the Jews. Okay, let's go to the third feast of the year, which is Sukkot, or tabernacles. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 13 through 16. You shall observe the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Sukkot, 7 days, when you have gathered from your threshing floor and from your winepress. Okay, this is, again, an agricultural term. And you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, and the Levite, the stranger, the grafted in Gentile. Chapter 11, verses 13 through 25, and Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 12. And the fatherless and the widow who are within your gates. 7 days you shall keep a sacred feast to Yahovah your Elohim in the place which Yahovah chooses, which is Jerusalem. Because Yahovah your Elohim will bless you in all the produce and all the work of your hands, so that you surely rejoice. 3 times a year all your males shall appear before Yahovah your Elohim in the place which he chooses, Jerusalem, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, Pentecost, and at the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot. And they shall not appear before Yahovah empty-handed. Bring your free will offering. Okay, now we're going to go to 2 Chronicles chapter 8 and verses 12 and 13, where it mentions these 3 feasts again. Then Solomon offered burnt offerings to Yahovah on the altar of Yahovah, which he, Solomon, had built before the vestibule, according to the daily rate. And folks, that daily rate, I mean to tell you, it has numbered how many animals were sacrificed on a daily rate, and it is almost incomprehensible how many animals were sacrificed on a daily rate. According to the daily rate offering, according to the commandment of Moses, for the Sabbaths, for the new moons, and the 3 appointed yearly feasts. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot. Okay, so there we have it, folks. The evidence in Scripture proves without a shadow of doubt that the biblical feasts are not only for the Jews, because the grafted in Gentiles were invited and welcomed by the Father to celebrate the feast as well. When he had instructed the native-born Israelite to celebrate these feasts, the Gentiles who had come out of Egypt with them, which the Bible, the King James Bible, calls the mixed multitude, Exodus chapter 12 and verse 38, and Numbers chapter 11 and verse 4, these Gentiles were also at the base of Mount Sinai with the native-born children of Israel when the instructions and teachings concerning the feast were given by the Father. So the feasts are not only for the Jews, folks. The Gentiles who had chosen to come out of Egypt with the children of Israel, who had chosen to be grafted in and assimilated among the house of Israel, they are invited and welcomed to partake of these feasts as well. So the feasts are not only for the Jews. Okay, so talking about these Gentiles who came out of Egypt with the children of Israel, is it unreasonable to think that these Gentiles also heeded the warning to apply the blood of a lamb on their doorposts? Is it possible that they heeded the warning and applied the blood, and the plague of the death of the firstborn did not, it passed over their houses as well? Is it possible? You know what? I think it could be. But that's just my opinion. It is important to note that the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Sukkot, is such an important and significant feast in the eyes of the Father that he is going to insist that all the Gentile nations that survive the Battle of Armageddon make the pilgrimage trip to Jerusalem every year to celebrate this feast during the millennial reign of Messiah Yeshua. So how can the feast be only for the Jews? Okay, we're going to find this in Zechariah, aka Zechariah, chapter 14 and verses 16 through 19. And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations, of all the Gentile nations, which came against Jerusalem, shall go up from year to year to worship the King, Yahovah of hosts, Yahovah of his armies, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whichever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, Yahovah of his armies, on them there shall be no rain. If the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. They shall receive the plague, which Yahovah strikes the nations, strikes the Gentile nations, who do not come up to Jerusalem year by year to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the Gentile nations that do not come up to Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, folks, I present the evidence that is right there in your own Bibles. The bottom line is this: the Father invites all and welcomes all, grafted in Gentiles. And the grafted in Gentiles are those Gentiles who have chosen to be assimilated among the nation of Israel, among the house of Israel, among the commonwealth of Israel. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 12. To celebrate the feast, all the feast, right along with the native born Israelite. The feast are not only for the Jews. So when we read John, his Hebrew name being Yohanan, chapter 5 and verse 1 and chapter 7 and verse 2, where it says the feast of the Jews or the Jews' feast, we must understand what it is saying in light of what was previously stated in the Torah. Because what has already been established by the Father remains established. And what was established by the Father was that the grafted in Gentiles were allowed, were invited, were welcomed to keep the feast right along with the native born Israelite. Of the 88 times that the word feast is used in the so-called New Testament, only 3 of those times do we have the word Jews connected with the word feast. And interesting enough, all 3 of these times, these verses are found only in the book of John. Additionally, of the 123 times that the word feast is used in the entire King James Bible, we find 16 times that we read the feast of the Lord or the feast to the Lord. So we have 16 out of 123 verses in the entire Bible saying that the feasts are of or to the Lord, according to the King James Bible. And we have 3 out of the 123 verses in the entire Bible saying the feast of the Jews. In the book of John alone, we have the word feast, referring to the biblical feast, mentioned 19 times without the phrase of the Jews being mentioned. And yet, lawless religion has chosen, for whatever reason, to ignore the 123 verses and focus on the 3 of the 19 verses found only in the book of John, to firmly establish in the minds of believers today that the feasts of the Bible were only for the Jews. Why is the book of John indicating that the feasts were only for the Jews? It is my opinion that it is possible that when the word Jews was mentioned with the feast in the book of John, and the book of John was written 20 to 30 years after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, that I was surprised to read that. but the book of John was not even written until 20 to 30 years after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Again, it's my opinion that it is possible that when the word Jews was mentioned with the feast in the book of John, that it was being used in order to distinguish these feasts from the numerous other feasts of the Roman Empire. That's just one possible explanation. Another possibility is that the translators of the book of John were completely unaware of what was contained in the Torah concerning the feast and just assumed that these feasts were only for the Jews. Who knows what happened? But regardless of what the 3 out of the 19 verses in John say, or what the 3 out of the 123 verses in the entire so-called New Testament says. Now, back here, I said the entire Bible. I may be wrong on that, okay? I think these 123 verses are, well, I tell you what. For me, this really bugs me. If I've made a mistake here, I cannot let this word study go without finding out. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to here, and let me transfer that over to this left screen so I can show you guys what I'm doing. Okay, so I have the word, well, let me go back to the left screen. Okay, so here we have a Bible program that is embedded in my Linux Mint operating system. But you can see that, let me get my mouse back over to my other screen. You can see that I have the word feast. Okay. So, right. So we have all these times that the word feast is mentioned in the so-called New Testament. There's only 36. So I was wrong, okay, when I mentioned the 123 verses. That is the entire Torah. Let's find out if I am even right on that. So we're going to go to the, let me get my mouse over here to the entire Bible, and we're going to search again. Okay, now I have done a search on the entire Bible. And folks, you have to pardon me because I've got 2 screens going here and I am not used to this. So I have to find my mouse again. So we have the word feast, and we did a search in the entire Bible, and it is in the entire Bible that we have 123 times that the word feast is mentioned, and only 3 of those times, all in the book of John, do we have the word Jews connected to the word feast in the same verse. Okay, so I wanted to clarify that for myself. So let me go ahead and get back to the word study here. Okay, now we're back to the word study. So yeah, I apologize for that. I will correct that the 123 times is not in the New Testament. It is in the entire Bible. So I will correct that after I let you guys go. I'm taking up too much of your time already. Okay, so regardless of what the 3 out of the 19 verses in John say, or what the 3 out of the 123 verses in the entire Bible says, the fact remains that the Father welcomes and invites the grafted-in Gentiles to celebrate the feast right along with the native-born Israelite, which means that the feasts are not only for the Jews. Okay, Yohanan chapter 12 and verse 20. Now, there were certain Greeks, these are Gentiles, among those who came up to worship at the feast, who came up to Jerusalem to worship at the feast of Passover unleavened bread. So there we go. The Gentiles were invited and welcomed to celebrate the feast right along with the native-born Israelite. Okay, folks, I will leave it here for today. I appreciate you guys being here, and I apologize for that mistake that I made. I will correct that. But I love you guys, and I appreciate you guys who watch my word study videos. And if you're here for the first time, I welcome you, and I appreciate you being here, stopping by, and checking out these hidden scripture word studies. So I will let you go. I've held you guys long enough. And I apologize. I will have to, when I edit this, I will have to put in a break somewhere in the middle. So I will take care of that. So I love you guys. I appreciate you being here. And Father willing, we will meet again in the next Hidden Scriptures Word Study. Shalom Aleichem, and the blessings of Yahovah the Father be on you and your families. Okay, Shalom Aleichem. Oh, bye-bye.